5 speakers. We've got speakers from all around the world, South Africa, Germany, Sweden, and like to treat Queensland as a bit of a different part of the country as well of Australia, because they're a bit special up there. So, but Sam's going to join us from Queensland. The format of this morning's talks, we have 5 speakers all talking about catch and release fishing. Each speaker has 15 minutes, and if we've got time, we might be able to take 1 or 2 questions, but we may not have time. So what we do is each speaker has 15 minutes. At the end of all 5 talks, we'll then invite all 5 speakers up onto a panel and we'll do a 15 minutes of questions and answers. So if you've got questions, write down who you'd like to ask that question of and what your question is, and Anthony's going to go around with that. Anthony, wave his hand down here, he's going to help out. He's going to have the roving microphone at the very end, and we're going to do those questions and answers. So to kick it off, I'll invite Warren Potts all the way from South Africa to talk about catch and release.
Right, thanks very much, David. Let's see. Right, there we go. Morning, everyone. I'm really honoured to be here. And following Sasha's talk, I'm going to try and give a bit of perspective on what we've been doing in South Africa in terms of breaking that knowledge-action gap in terms of catch and release angling. And so I'm going to be reviewing a decade-long behavioural change intervention that we've been doing with some recreational anglers. So, what's going on? As Sasha mentioned, catch and release activities are incredibly important for the sustainability of recreational fish stocks. And we've largely done the science, although there's still quite a lot to be done, but we've largely done the science that have informed us about what catch and release practices should essentially look like. But understanding how to take that science and turn it into actual practice is something that we're lagging behind quite a lot. So it's really the intervention science. And there's been several ideas banded around on how you actually, how you can actually potentially get action happening from this best practice. But this talk is really just to give you an example from South Africa on how we've tried to improve catch and release angling with a group of competitive anglers. And then I'll also try and provide some kind of recommendations on how you can engage with anglers to improve their environmental behavior. So this case study involves a group of recreational anglers called the Rock and Surf Super Pro League. Or the RASPL, they were established in 2011. They have approximately 1,000 members in South Africa and Namibia. They're exclusively a catch and release angling league, so no fish are kept during any of the competitive events. And there are 8 coastal franchises all the way along the South African and Namibian coasts. And we specifically chose to work with competitive anglers because we often find that competitive anglers generally tend to set the bar for behavior. They're generally the better anglers, and the general angling public look to competitive anglers to, sort of, and emulate the types of things that they do on the water. So this is the group we chose to work with. They've got a fairly complicated system of fishing. Here's some of the examples of the species that you catch on our coastal waters from the shore. But for each different species that you catch, you get a certain number of bonus points for the species, for the first individual of each species that you catch, depending on their rarity. Then additional points if you catch 6 species in a given day, you get 200 extra bonus points. If you catch 10 species in a given day, you get an additional 200 bonus points. And then you get points per kilogram for teleosts and elasmobranchs. There's a very specific system. When you land a fish, you basically need to put it directly into a bucket where it's photographed, and then out of the bucket measured and photographed, and then a final photograph for some specimens that are generally larger, holding the fish with your back to the sea. And that's the standard practice for every fish. But often it opens up enormous potential for really heightened air exposure using this sort of photograph technique. So we had to try and fix the way anglers were dealing with their fish. So in terms of our history, in 2012 we were invited to fish some of the competitions by one of the leaders of the franchise of the RASPL. 5 of our lab members then decided to actually join and fish, and by the end of that year we realized that there was a real need for developing a good scoring system for them. And so we developed a very simple access database scoring system that they could very easily just enter in the fish caught, and it would work out the complex scoring system so that you could understand who won and got prizes for whatever fish that the prizes were planned for. And that database we also used to begin collecting catch and effort and length frequency information for our purposes. And then I was in 2014, I was invited to become part of the national committee, and I was tasked with improving fish handling. And it's very easy to just think that if you need to improve fish handling, you've got all these ideas about what needs to be done. But we decided to take a more strategic approach. So what we decided to do was adopt a pro-environmental behavioural approach, which we chose the one that Geller recommended in 2002, which entails 4 components. It's basically carefully selecting the behaviours that you'd like to change, examine the factors that cause the behaviours, and then apply well-tuned strategies to try and change those relevant behaviours, and then ultimately systematically evaluate the effects of these interventions. And that last component, evaluating the effects, is absolutely critical, because you need to understand what's working, what isn't, and then you reassess and perhaps change the kinds of interventions that you're doing. So we went on and we, in 2015, we did a baseline survey. So before we even started any interventions, we decided, let's collect baseline information and try and figure out what the problems are in this catch and release competition. And there we measured the behavior of anglers and the health of fish. And we published a paper on it in Fisheries Research giving us the baseline information, but then we used that information to essentially initiate a range of different interventions for improving fish health in the competitions. And these included structural changes, like changes to the rules, okay? Things, for example, like the maximum distance an angler could fish away from his bucket, the fact that his bucket always had to be full of fresh seawater, and that you couldn't share a bucket between different anglers. And then we also implemented a range of different strategies. For example, antecedent strategies, which are things that precede the behavior, things like information, where we raised the problem awareness with anglers, so that the issues that we saw at the national events. We then had an extensive education drive looking at things, gave presentations like on the science of catch and release angling, and how we could work together as 2 sort of groups. And then we developed a whole lot of modeling videos, basically showing exactly how the catch and release event should take place in the context of the competition. And then we held competitions for anglers to enter their versions of videos and then critique those in a positive way mostly. And then finally we had consequence strategies, which included rewards for individuals and for teams, where we saw particularly good catch and release behavior. We had penalties written into rules where fish would be disqualified if anglers handled fish badly. And then we gave, at the end of every national event, feedback in terms of presentations and then final reports. So it was a fairly comprehensive set of interventions that we introduced. And then we went along and started monitoring angler behavior and fish health at the subsequent events. And what we found, amazingly, was real improvements in a wide variety of angler behavior metrics, such as the distance that anglers were from the bucket, the time that they took to get a fish into the bucket, and then overall air exposure, which decreased for all fish from just over 100 seconds, which is absolutely awful, so we didn't have a good baseline to work from, down to just below 80 seconds in the space of those couple of years, which said to us we were on the right track. And we felt that we were approaching a much better, sort of health and survival for the fish, and we could see that in the fish health indicators. So for reflex action mortality predictors, we found that the values were dropping quite rapidly, and we found that physiologically the fish were in better condition with lower, for example, lactate concentrations in their blood. And so overall, fairly positive. But what we realized is that we were taking an inordinate amount of time engaging with these recreational anglers and developing material and guiding them through the process. And we wanted to see if this was in any way sustainable. But first, so in order for it to be sustainable, we needed to basically remove ourselves or certain parts of it away and do less and see that they actually carried on behaving better. And so we first did a survey to figure out which of the indicators, which of the interventions they felt had helped them. So we looked at about 50 anglers whose behavior we'd seen improve over time, and we interviewed them and we asked them about the different components and the different interventions. And we tried to figure out which ones were most important to them to improve their behavior. And we found overwhelmingly that informational presentations, the rule changes, and the video modeling seemed to have the biggest effect for the anglers in terms of what they thought helped their behavior. And so then we decided, okay, let's see if we can create a test to see whether this program is in fact sustainable. And we used a definition of sustainability that a project is sustainable when the defects can be corrected. It's able to meet the new requirements, and in this case we were looking at the angler behavior, whether it was things that improved, and whether future maintenance is made easier and can cope with the changes in the environment. And we found we then cut out video monitoring, modeling, information presentations, and conservation prizes out of the process completely. And then we remonitored for an additional 2 years. And we found that, in fact, the angler behavior in terms of air exposure improved further. Okay, so we'd gotten to a situation where air exposure times were still improving. We were contributing far less, yet things were still getting better. We don't yet know if we'll be able to cope with the changing environment, but we're going to test this again now after COVID, and we'll assume that's a bit of a change. And so by all intents and purposes, this looks as though it was a sustainable effort. We then did semi-structured interviews with the franchise managers to figure out what the main reason was for the perceived for the improved angler behavior in 2018 and 2019. And almost all of the franchise managers concluded that it was actually that conservation trophy that we'd given out every year that made anglers want to win the trophy, and subsequently they had their own training programs and their own processes in place which actually improved angler behavior without our intervention. And that for me was like this real eureka moment, and it really said to me that if you want to get anglers to engage and want to improve, you have to figure out that thing that drives them. And each group of anglers is different. They have their own motivations, their own contexts, etc. But when you figure out what that thing is that makes them do what they do, you can tap into that and get them to alter their behavior and maintain their altered behavior. Okay, so finally, and I'm sorry I'm taking a bit long here, our recommendations are invest in the long term. Don't think it's going to happen overnight if you want to change angler behavior. Try and build trust. If you can, join their anglers, but offer them a service, offer them something that is useful to them. In our case, we offered them the scoring database. Measure your baseline. Without measuring your baseline, you don't know if you're being effective in your behavioral change intervention. Absolutely critical. Use a huge combination of strategies, antecedent strategies, structural strategies, and consequent strategies in your interventions. When you do use rule changes, make sure that you've got the data to back it up, to explain to anglers why you're doing it so that they recognize that you're doing things for a reason. And then you must monitor and adapt as required. And for sustainable projects, work out what that thing is that makes anglers tick and try and incorporate that into your interventions. And with that, I thank you very much.
All right, a big thanks to Warren, and we'll get Warren back up on stage after the next 4 speakers for some questions. Our next speaker is Simon Weltersbach. I think I've got that right. Simon is all the way from Germany. Simon has got a pretty rough voice today. The air conditioning on the plane wasn't too kind. I was just talking to Queensland counterparts there, and we've worked out the remedy, Simon, is Bundaberg rum. So if anyone that doesn't know what Bundaberg rum is, you won't get it from a pharmacy or a chemist, but ask for Bundaberg rum tonight. That might make the voice a little bit better. But over to Simon.
Thank you. Yeah, as you can hear, my voice is really bad, so I try my best. I was not drinking last night, so I think it's really the air conditioning. I'm going to present you an experiment we did in Denmark. So this is actually a collaborative work between the Technical University of Denmark, the Institute of Marine Research in Norway, and my institution, which is the Thun Institute of Baltic Sea Fisheries, located in Germany. So why did we actually study post-release mortality of sea trout? Well, sea trout is a pretty popular recreational target species in Europe, but of course also in other countries around the world. And so what I mean with sea trout is always anadromous brown trout. And we have pretty high catch and release rates, especially around countries in the Baltic Sea. So, for example, in Germany we have release rates around 50%, and in Denmark up to 80%, so very high release rates. But surprisingly, there were very limited information on catch and release practices, as well as lethal and sublethal impacts when you are looking at the marine environment. So there are some studies out for brown trout in freshwater systems, and of course also studies for other trout species, but not for sea trout in the sea. So our study aimed to evaluate patterns of hooking locations and bleeding for different lure and hook types. I will go to the treatments later. And we also wanted to assess post-release mortality, growth effects, and also hooking wound healing. And the third goal was to identify key factors influencing post-release mortality, growth, and wound healing, which can then be a base for developing best practice recommendations for anglers. And we conducted a containment study. So we had this really nice raceway in Denmark. And the nice thing with this raceway is that we have 3 different supplies of water. So one supply is directly from the North Sea, where you can get fresh seawater into it. Then there's a ground-fed water supply with fresh water, and you can also recycle water in the raceway. So we could adjust the water flows of the different water supplies to get the conditions we wanted to have. So, for example, to adjust the salinity to a certain level. And we also placed some hiding places, so these rectangulars that were hiding places for the trout. And we also put some protection for avian predation on it, so some ropes over it to cover the whole system. So what we did, we got hatchery trout, so they were from wild parents, and we stocked 520 of these trouts, which were pit tagged, so that we could identify each individual. And we started in March 2021. And before we started the experimental angling, we had an acclimation period of about 27 days, so the fish could adjust to the new environment and get used to it. And then we had 2 experimental anglers who fished during the experiment, and we had actually 4 treatments. So we had first a control group that were fish that we caught with a seine net in the system at the start of the experiment. And then we had 3 angling treatments. So one was spin fishing with a lure and a single hook, and one was spin fishing with the same lures. So we used these lures, as you can see on the right picture. So spoons and a fly. And so there were two treatments with lures, one with a single hook and one with a treble hook, and then there was a third treatment with a fly, which was equipped with a single hook. And we caught the fish with these lures, and we recorded several information for each fish, for example, the weight, of course, the tag number, and the hooking location, etc. So we collected these data, and after the data collection, all fish were released back in the system and held up to 29 days, depending on the day of angling. So the angling took 2 days, and the fish were held then for up to 29 days at different temperatures between 4 to 10 degrees, which is actually the temperature where most fishing occurs in the Baltic Sea area. So it's the spring temperature of the water. So one important factor that we recorded was the hooking location, and we had this schematic view of the trout and the mouth, and we had several hooking locations. So there were, for example, 3 different hooking locations in the mouth area, with one in the outer lips and one inside, and also the corner of the mouth. So these were the categories where we classified the individual hooking of the trout. And that are just some examples of the hooking locations. So if you look on the left lower picture, you see like a foul hooking. So the hook was penetrating the body. And on the right lower picture, you see outside hooking in the lips. So now I'm coming to some results. So for example, this shows you the incidence of hooking locations during these experimental fishing. And you see some differences between the fly caught fish and the lure caught fish. So the lure caught fish were pretty similar in terms of the incidences of hooking locations between the single and the treble hooks. But there were more fish caught on fly that were hooked in the corner of the mouth or in the back of the mouth, and less, for example, body hooking, which is of course, which we expected actually, because fly fishing is of course not that active compared to spin fishing, where you really pull the lure with a treble hook through the system. Anyway, there were not really significant differences between these 3 treatments, probably also because of the relatively low sample size of the fly caught fish. So in the end, there were no statistical differences between hooking locations between the different angling treatments. And then we had incidences of bleeding. So we had 3 categories. If fish were no bleeding at all, slight bleeding, or heavy bleeding. And again, you see a bit of a trend that the fly caught fish showed less bleeding than the lure caught fish. But again, this was not statistically significant when we tested it. And what was really surprising was actually the mortality that we observed, because it was a 0 mortality at all. And we really didn't expect this, because we had quite some long air exposure times, and also we had a few fish that were heavily bleeding, not many, but a few, and they all survived during the holding period. So that was really surprising us, that there was no mortality at all. So then we looked at hooking wound healing, and we developed a healing score. So we had 4 different healing scores. The first one was actually that you didn't see any wound after the holding period, and then this goes up to score 4, where we really see like a bad infection or something like that. So there was still a very poor wound healing. And we applied this to the fish, and these are the results. So again, you see the wound healing score from 1 to 4. And on the left panel, you see the scores for the different treatments, so the fly caught fish, the lure caught fish with single hook, and the lure caught fish with treble hook. And you see that there was a difference between the fly caught fish and the treble hook, indicated by the star, as a statistical difference. So there were less fish in the fly caught fish that had really bad or poor wound healing, indicating that the fly fishing was a bit more fish friendly in a way. And the same if you look at the bleeding, so how bleeding affected wound healing. And again, you see that there was a difference between fish that were not bleeding at all and then the fish that were heavy bleeding, where we had few fish with the non-bleeding fish that were scored a 4, and these are missing in the heavy bleeding group, but overall the average was much worse in the heavy bleeding group. So wound healing was worse when we saw a heavy bleeding in the fish. 1 minute? Okay. So I just go quick to the growth rates. As you can see, there were no significant differences between specific growth rates between the 4 treatments. So the control fish, the fly caught fish, and the lure caught fish, they all grew more or less similar. And you can also see here that there was some effect on the when you look at the healing score and the specific growth rates, but this was not significant. So the poor wound healing, there was kind of a trend that they grew less, but this was not significant in the test. So to get to the conclusion, we saw that bleeding was significantly influenced by the hooking location, but not by angling method. Few fish showed severe hooking injuries, and we saw a very high survival in general, even though we had some fish with heavy bleeding, and despite quite long air exposure times due to our experimental setting, there were no differences in growth, but wound healing seems to be an important factor. And so to conclude, actually, it seems like the effects of catch and release on coastal sea trout may be limited and may not pose a significant population problem. But of course, this was very experimental, so you need more studies on the long-term effects and also under more natural conditions, for example, by using tagging studies or other methods. So thank you very much, and if you have questions later on, please ask. Thank you. And there's a paper, actually.
Thank you, Simon. As I mentioned earlier on, if you've got any questions for Simon, Simon will be joining us on the panel after the next 3 speakers. All right, I'll welcome the next speaker up all the way from Sweden, Sam Blyth.
Thank you very much. It's really exciting to be here and sharing this work, project that was led by my colleague Emma Bjorkvik, who's not able to be with us here this week, looking at the role that private fisheries managers have in communicating catch and release best practices when they're selling licenses to people fishing in Sweden. So today I'm going to give you a little bit of a context as to how these fisheries operate or how they're structured. This is quite a bit different than what you have here in Australia, and a lot of people work in recreational fisheries in North America and other places work with. And what objectives we had in initiating this study, what we want to find out, what data's there, what's missing, how we gather our data, and the key findings we had on what cases where there is mandatory catch and release, how that relates to presence or mostly absence of best practices, and what different fisheries look like that are doing better or worse at communicating this type of information, and how that relates to specifically what species are being managed as well. So in Sweden, we've got two main kind of categories for recreational angling. You've got these open access fisheries on the coast and the 5 biggest lakes where there's no licenses required and management is done at the kind of state level, setting up what regulations exist. But then in all other inland fisheries and freshwater, the rights or the ownership of fish are part of property rights. And so you have individual people or groups that come together to pool their resources that are making the management decisions for these fisheries. There's limited levels of outside control for mandating what they're allowed to do, what rules they're allowed to set, and a surprising lack of coordination between a lot of these management units. As well, these are places where a lot of the fishing is occurring in Sweden. A lot of people are going to summer houses in the countryside in the summer, so you're looking at potentially hundreds of thousands, or it's about 1.5 million people fishing in Sweden each year. So a lot of fishing activity occurring in this privately managed context. And in these fisheries, we see a long-term trend where catch and release is increasing as a practice. This is part of management tools that are being enacted in more and more of these management units, things like size limits, stuff like that, but also just an overall trend in proportions of catches that are being released as more people are also adopting voluntary catch and release as part of their angling practices. And as we had outlined earlier by Sasha's presentation, there's a lot of evidence that just releasing the fish doesn't mean that it's going to have a successful outcome. How you release that fish really matters. And particularly in these private fisheries where people aren't having to buy a national license, and especially for less avid anglers that aren't on social media looking at people handling fish in particular ways or going out of their way to read information about how to improve their fishing ability. Often these interactions they have with the individual person or organization selling them a license in these fisheries is the only place where they're getting advice on how to perform their fishing activity. And what we want to know is, are these private managers actually communicating information that will help improve release outcomes, and also in cases where they have mandated catch and release, required release of certain fish, are they doing things that are actually going to ensure that those tools they're using work? So what we did was look at a representative sample of the organizations that we can find that are selling licenses through online platforms in Sweden, and this is an increasing access point for people getting licenses in these fisheries. In some cases, you still have to track down Johan, buy him a cup of coffee, and he'll write out something on a piece of paper saying you're allowed to fish. But more and more places, you're getting your license and your information on what rules you have to follow and how you fish in these areas through online points. And for each of these, we gathered information on what type of water the fishery is managing, whether that's running water or lakes, what types of species are being targeted, what rules exist for the different species, and as many other characteristics of how those fishing rights owners are trying to manage what their fishery is. And just as a bit of an aside, you can see the map there. That gives you a bit of a picture of the range of different sizes and not necessarily watershed scale level that this management occurs at. And that further north in the country you have pretty good coverage, and further south it gets a bit spotty as to where you can even find information for all the water that exists that does have fish in it. So out of our sample, the vast majority of them, as I've touched on, have rules that necessitate the release of at least some of the catches that are being made. And these are common rules that a lot of people recognize if you do any fishing: minimum and maximum sizes, size windows, bag limits, or seasonal restrictions on keeping particular species that are maybe more vulnerable at different times of the year. But in spite of this high requirement for releasing fish, as well as the voluntary release that's occurring, only about 1 in 5 organizations provided any information on how to make those releases function better or as well as possible. And of those that had any best practice information being presented, most of them only had one best practice, and a lot of them were addressing fish in general or missing things that might be more important for specific fisheries, like barrow trauma for some of the most targeted species. And things that come up a lot in the material that comes from Keep Fish Wet, the universally important best practices, like keeping the fish wet, handling them in the water, things that could be applied across the board, only come up in 12 out of over 300 sites that we're looking at. So very small percentage are communicating this type of stuff. And we also commonly found mentions of things like release the fish in a way that is good for the fish, or be kind to the fish that you're releasing, without anything to actually qualify what that means. So the intention is there, or the desire to do things well is there, but not following through in a way that helps people, particularly less avid anglers that have opportunities to learn, actually do things better. So we wanted to look at who's doing this well, what are the characteristics of the organizations that are doing this well, and which particular fisheries are the weakest on communicating this in this information landscape that is quite devoid of best practices. So we did a cluster analysis looking at a few of the key measures that we made, and then compared those groupings to a bunch of the other characteristics that we'd taken in. And we can put them into two main categories, one being the areas that have little or no information, that more commonly are managing lake fisheries, and at the time that we were doing the data collection, we're more commonly using one particular license sales platform. For the groups that had at least some information, and the second half, group 5, actually all of them had at least one best practice, they're more likely to be managing stream fisheries and selling licenses at a higher price, indicating some economic component to the value of these fish that are being released. And as well, we could see some patterns relating to which species are being managed or which families of fish were being managed that are worth investigating a little bit further. And so, there we go. That we want to look at in which cases they had specific or species-specific regulations saying you had to release certain species, and what portion of those fishing or management organizations also provided best practices related to those species. And then how did that ratio compare to the national level release rates for those species? Is it related or not? So here at the top, we've got the total counts for instances where there was mandatory release for some of the main species that were covered, and then which portion of those mentions were accompanied by a best practice. Our lowest coverage was for pike, with only 17% of cases where there were rules necessitating the release of at least some catches, having any advice on how to do that well. And the best was grayling, with 39%, which is quite good compared to the overall average, but still quite low. When we compared that to the national landings data, you can see significant differences in the proportion of what releases are occurring to what information is being presented to anglers, particularly for the 4 most popular species. And pike, again, is an extreme example where 83% of catches are being released nationally, but only 17% of organizations selling licenses or managing pike fisheries are providing information on how to do that well. And a good amount of the catch and release research on pike comes from Sweden. There are people who have a vested interest in communicating this in the country. And it's similar significant differences for perch, zander, and brown trout as well as the other species, but they're not landed in the same numbers. And so overall, we can see that there's quite a deficiency in both the quantity and quality of best practice information for catch and release being provided in these fisheries, and that there's great opportunities for improving communication, particularly for the lake fisheries and for pike and perch being like the most targeted, most landed species. And particularly as these fisheries are the ones that, the less avid people, the people who aren't already, participating in angling tournaments, as we had in Warren's presentation, and aren't on fishing social media, getting sashes messages and things like that. This is where we're going to be able to reach these less avid anglers in a country where a lot of people are fishing. So with that, I'll wrap up with where we're going to go next. We want to look at how these best practices came to be, communicated in a good way, and how can we help those organizations that aren't communicating them as well bring better messages forward, and look at where these less avid anglers want to find this information and how we can get these messages across. So thank you very much, and I look forward to answering any questions that you have at the end of the session.
Alrighty, from one Sam to another. The next Sam Williams, all the way from Queensland. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks for that. Now, the talk I'm going to give today is from a project called Fishing for Change. And before I go on, I just want to highlight FRDC as the funders, Curry Consulting, who led the project, as well as the huge input from Griffith University Social Marketing and the Centre for Marine Socioecology. What I'll be talking about today is around a pilot project which was looking at behaviour change interventions for recreational fishers in Queensland. Now, recreational fishing is a popular leisure activity in Queensland, probably much more popular than it is in Victoria, as our Victorian counterparts like to try and arc on about how big it is down here. And yeah, recreational fishing, as you'll hear throughout the conference, it delivers huge social and mental health benefits, as well as just providing an enjoyable leisure activity. And recreational fishers obviously are really good marine stewards. They engage in citizen science, marine stocking, habitat rehabilitation, a range of activities. But despite this good stewardship, anglers can still have an impact on the resource. So in Queensland, probably our most characteristic example of this is snapper and pearl perch, which are really popular table fish, demersal fish, and are both depleted in Queensland waters. And really, it's highlighted to us that we do need to take some pressure off the stock in able to rebuild those populations. And while we're saying that, anglers are a part of, contributing, they're not the sole ones responsible for the decline, but they are primary harvest sector, so they are an important part. There we go. Now, so there's been about 30 years of management changes for particularly snapper in Queensland, and despite ongoing management intervention, we just haven't seen a rebound in the population that we would like to see. And this has led to, even up as recent as 2020, a spawning closure going in to just try and protect them while they spawn and take a little bit of impact off the stock. But beyond this, it got us thinking, what more can we do? Are there voluntary measures out there that we could use with the support of recreational fishers that might even be more effective than regulation alone? And so really what we were looking at was using social marketing as a people-centric approach to try and create behaviour change in a way to help solve the problem. And there's a big and here as well, which was part of it. And this is really why it's a pilot. It was about, can we also quantify the effectiveness? Because we see a lot of behaviour change programs getting up, like, give flake a break or take a feed, not a fridge full. But it's actually, what is the impact of these programs, and are they actually having an impact that we want? So there was a really large component to actually come up with our intervention, and that was really a creative collective solutions approach, where we had initially a working group set up with representative fishers, and the first step was trying to define what's the key question we want to base this around. And fishers were really intent of having a positive message. So it came out of, what can fishers and interested parties do to help increase pearl perch and snapper stocks? This is opposed to something negative that might be, how can you reduce your catch or your impact? From there, we went out to the general public and we asked that question, what actions could people do to actually help contribute towards this message? And we had an overwhelming response. So 239 stakeholders from 14 representative groups provided feedback. That was 923 actions that we had to collate, and 48 of them identified as unique. Now, the next stage, we worked with stakeholders again to try and narrow these down into groups and categories where we could identify, okay, which ones are actions that fit into that behaviour change social marketing application. And we really landed on, you know, there's a couple of key ones here, like recreational fisher behaviour change, what to catch, education, communication awareness. But then there were other things. There was a lot of feedback around input and output controls, so regulation and compliance activities. So these were sort of out of scope. Now, the final stage was once we found those categories of interest, we needed to narrow down our candidate behaviour. And once again, working with anglers, we looked at the likelihood of adoption, the impact of adoption, and the size of the target audience. And there was a range of things like just simply abiding by size and catch limits, trying to catch less fish than your bag limits. But the end question and the top candidate that came out was actually fishers catching other fish species. So trying to say, okay, can we take pressure off pearl perch and snapper by looking to switch onto alternative species? So this became our campaign. And, our behaviour was really between April and September 2021, and I'll note 2021 COVID, so that was good fun. Recreational fishers departing from Sunshine Coast ramps, we wanted them to catch more of these alternative species, being mahi-mahi, amberjack and cobia. Now, we worked with a lot of local social influencers, and I've got to put a shout out to SCF Fishing. They jumped on board and really helped coordinate the rec fishing community and get on board and promote this. So we did a lot of online social media promotion during the time. We also did on-ground work, so we had a launch event, we had signs at boat ramps, we had people handing out flyers, just creating that broader awareness. And then the final stage was just sharing that knowledge and trying to educate people. So we had newsletters going out, we had how-to videos on social media, and we had the website that's still up. It's on the final slide, and if you want to have a look at what was done, there's some really good content. So as far as the social marketing perspective, it was a success. You know, we reached more than 20,000 people in the short pilot project, and that's 20,000 individuals from our target audience. Our target audience was males aged 25 to 55 located on the Sunshine Coast. And of that, there's about 39 to 45,000 of them there. So about half of, the target audience there. And then more importantly though, did we actually affect behaviour change? So we were lucky here that we actually had a baseline. Fisheries Queensland have been doing boat ramp surveys at these boat ramps. So we're able to compare basically before the intervention period as well as during it to understand if there was a shift in behaviour. And we had to have a number of controls to account for things like COVID, putting out new fishery aggregation devices, as well as just, good runs of fish. So we had the Gold Coast as a control area as well. So it was a short pilot, and we were looking at signatures of change. So these are sort of exploratory signatures around some of our key boat ramp survey questions. And it was hierarchical. So the first level we wanted to see was, did we increase targeting of the campaign species? So people saying all of a sudden, I haven't fished for these before, I now want to go fish for these new species. The next was, did they actually catch those? And then finally, the last two were the flow-on consequence. Did we actually result in switching away from our at-risk species or decreasing catch rates there? Now, this is where it becomes a little bit dry, and I'll try and walk you through it a little bit. So basically, the top bar is the Gold Coast region, so that's our control. The bottom section is the Sunshine Coast, so that's our focal area. And the first section of it is 2019, and you can see there's really no green blips in that 2019 period or the 2020, meaning that mahi-mahi, our target species, hadn't been recorded as a target species in the survey. Then during that last panel, as soon as the survey started, we started to see people saying, hey, actually, I'm targeting those. I'm going out there for them today. So that was a really nice initial indication that we might be getting through. We saw something similar as well with cobia. So we saw basically the first indications of people actually saying, I want to go and target cobia out of the Sunshine Coast at these boat ramps during this time of year, during the campaign period where we hadn't seen it historically. So it was really great for us to see that we could detect that. And then the second level was increasing catches. So we also saw a little bit of this too. We did see detectable increases in cobia catches. So the blue line that bumps up, that's the Sunshine Coast, and you can see it bumping up during the 2021 campaign period, whereas the Gold Coast, our control region, just stayed relatively stable. So it was really cool to be able to actually see an effect from a project like this. Now, the hard questions, and the jury's really still out on this, but what we found was when it came to targeting of our more vulnerable species, snapper and pearl perch, we did actually see a decrease. So you can see that the blue box plot for 2021 is slightly lower. So this was a really good indication that, yeah, maybe it is having an effect. But when we looked into the data, there was also the new closure that went in that year, and a lot of the surveys that we undertook were during that closure period. And obviously, during a closure, you're not going to say, oh, I'm targeting snapper when you can't actually target them. So I think that that's had an effect on the data there. And then we didn't really find actually a very positive result for catch rate. So we actually saw increased catches overall of pearl perch and snapper during this period. I guess what this really leads us to is that it suggests that we can monitor and effectively understand what our behaviour change campaigns, our social marketing is doing, and we can influence fisher behaviour. But our approach was based on basically trying to switch away from a target species to other ones. So it was an indirect message. And I think, we ended up achieving our goal, which was we were able to get people to switch to species, we just weren't able to get them to switch away from them. So really a big outcome here is you've got to tailor your message and target it to really what you truly want to achieve in some of these projects. And overall, from the short time period, I think it shows that these approaches can be really, really useful and successful. So on a final note, thanks for all of us. I would encourage you, if you want to see a sort of a 60-minute version of this talk with a bit more detail on the actual campaign, the Switch Your Fish website, visit it. There's still a lot of good content on there. Cheers.
All right, I'm not sure whether Kaitlyn's here, our next speaker. I haven't seen Kaitlyn at all. Oh, Kaitlyn is here. Beautiful. And Kaitlyn, you're from Canada? The place where the last in-person World Rec Fishing Conference was. There you go. So introduce Kaitlyn. There you go.
Thanks. All right, hello, good morning. Thank you for having me here. Let's hit the mouse. All right, so yeah, hi, I'm Katie. I'm a PhD student at the University of British Columbia, and I'm a part of Dr. Scott Hinch's lab. Today I'm going to be talking about a part of my PhD study that we did last summer. The title of my talk is Mechanisms Impacting the Short-Term Survival of Released Chinook Salmon. And first I'll just talk broadly about our public fisheries in BC. They're really important. In BC, we're lucky enough to have 5 species of Pacific salmon. And this is important for many reasons. Social and economic value to coastal British Columbia, huge impact on our GDP. A lot of money is moved all around the province due to this fishery. Fish are caught for fun, for food, many different reasons. Rec, commercial, First Nation fisheries. Specifically, I focus on Chinook salmon, arguably one of the best salmon. Their populations are in decline. They're already the least abundant species. They're also the largest bodied, and they have these really complex life histories where they have different amounts of time spent in freshwater versus the ocean. And they're the most sought after in the public fishery. They're really good to eat, they're fun to catch, and they're also sought after trophy fish. And due to conservation regulations such as slot limits, potentially marked selective fishery coming down the line, bycatch, catch and release is becoming more common. But when you have a catch and release fishery, this all balances on a really good understanding of what happens when you let these fish go. You need to really know how many fish are surviving that encounter. So why are we doing this study? A lot of my other PhD researchers largely focused on tagging, but tagging research it's focused on longer term survival. And say you detect a fish 2 weeks later, you don't know what happens really between release and potential detection. Some you don't detect at all, and we're trying to understand those more short-term mechanisms so we can bring this research and apply it to what we do tagging. Something else is that previous holding research has not been conducted at appropriate timescales. There's been research done in the past. A lot of that research was only done for 3 days, and I'll show you throughout the talk why that might have been an issue. In our research, in our lab, it's been shown through a study showing effects of a gillnet fishery, that 5 to 10 days were needed to see latent effects. So bringing that thought forward, how do we update this other science for Chinook in the rec fishery? So we're updating previously done holding studies, building on previous research with new knowledge and approaches, and we're doing this in partnership with the Sport Fishing Institute of BC, who are also at the conference. And in addition, this will help me interpret my behavioral and migratory patterns that I see in my telemetry tracking studies as well. And our overarching outcome, develop recommendations that will reduce physiological impacts on released Chinook salmon. Right, so I study Chinook on the west coast of Canada on Vancouver Island. If you look on the bottom left corner there, that's Vancouver Island, and in the box there is Barkley Sound. I work in a little community called Bamfield at the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center, which they study all aspects of the ocean, and it's a partner university with UBC. We're very lucky. And those are the holding tanks that we used that the SFI had built for us in this study. So it's a study design. It's a 2-week study period. So we fish over 4 days until we have our 60 fish, and then we do 10 days of holding. So they're about 2-week studies. We did 4 holding periods for replication. So 1 in June, July, August, and then at the end of August. And then we do 60 Chinook per hold. So we held about 250 fish. And we had a large size range. So what's kind of novel about this is that we used small fish as well. You can't tag the really small fish, and they've been kind of just looked past in previous work. And these are the fish that are released the most. So I think it's really important to include them in this work. That's something that's just been really looked over in the past. So we kind of caught everything that we could fit the fat probe onto, which I'll show you here. So all sizes. And then for our treatments, it's very simple. It's kind of surprising that these 2 treatments aren't concisely in the literature already. But we looked at different hooks, so treble hooks versus single hooks. Some research has been done in the past. It was done with barbs, just not done cleanly. Something I'd like to note is that our neighbors down in Washington don't allow treble hooks. Nudge, nudge, Canada. So, and then the other treatment we're looking at is bait versus artificials. A lot of fishermen and anglers have these questions, and it hasn't been concisely done either. A lot of bait research has been done in freshwater where the bait's really just sucked by the fish. We're doing a troll fishery here, so the fish is chasing, which is a lot of different action. All right, so I'm going to show a video here with our methods. We catch them mimicking the rec fishery. Big part of why I did my PhD at all. Got to do this for my job. Lovely. We take metrics for all aspects of the angling experience. I won't list them all just due to time. We have multiple boats fishing to catch fish for us. We record the experience, and then we bring them on board our processing boat. Once it's on board, you see me look at the label there. I take blood 15 minutes after capture, so we look at the time. Now my colleague Steve is processing the fish. We look at gill condition, is it bleeding, specific hook location, how badly was the fish hooked, scale loss, is the fish tracking, does it have equilibrium? We look at fin damage, that's something we classify due to nets, and just overall condition of the fish. And then here's the fat probe I talked about before, just gives you an energy index of the fish. It can tell you actually which river the fish is heading to. We pit tag the fish so they have a name, so we know who each one is in the tank. And then we take a gill biopsy for genomic biomarkers and infectious agents. And then you see me coming in here to take a blood sample. Blood sample gives you a lot of indicators of stress. We did this for every fish. It's cooperating very nicely. And then once we get the blood and all the fish on board, we process the blood. I process hematocrit, and I do whole blood as well. So plasma and red blood cells. And then after that's all done, we're on the way to the dock. I put them all in the -80 freezer to keep them out because we're remote, keep them frozen. And then we move the fish to the holding tank. So this is their journey. They go from the onboard holding tank into the coolers. My colleagues got very strong this summer. Low tide was rough. And then we go over to the holding tank. So this is what the fish look like going into the tank. And you can see they're actually quite happy in there. People haven't really held marine chrome Chinook in tanks, and Chinook are known to be pretty hard to hold, so we were pleasantly surprised at how happy they were in there. Didn't have to use pumps or anything, just the natural flow from the pipe and the inlet kept them really happy. So what did the fish look like at the end? At the end of the hold, any fish that I did animal care protocols that weren't euthanized made it to the end of the hold. I did a full necropsy on them. If you want more details, come ask me after. This time I'll keep going. This is what we really saw commonly at the end, just scale loss on the caudal peduncle of the fish. This is due to our handling. And this is just some more examples of what they look like on day 10. A lot of fish had damage in the caudal fin from the nets. That's an issue that we are starting to focus on more and more. Some fish look pristine. This fish here, you can see how the hook wound in the corner progressed over the 10 days. We actually have caught other fish that have pretty similar look to this as well. And then here's another example of a more advanced hook wound. It's also worth considering that these fish were just held in a tank for 10 days. In the wild, they'd probably look a lot better because they're going to be stressed in the tank. So you have to keep that in mind too. So I'll go over some preliminary results. This is just a very small part of what we found. Initially, we categorized or showed survival by size, but here we've grouped it by if fish are legal or not in our fishery. This plot here is called a Kaplan-Meier curve, and how you interpret it is every kind of drop in the line is a decrease in survival. So, for example, on day 1, the sublegal fish, probably 5 fish died upon capture. That's that initial drop, and then it goes down with time. And then I'd like to revisit again that day 3 I talked about before, so just to keep in mind here, if the holding study ended on day 3 like they had done in the past, we wouldn't have seen an impact. So this is really important, just thinking of more studies we do in the future. It's important to extend this time because those sublethal effects aren't necessarily shown right away on day 3, by day 3, so it can be shown across time. So as you can see, sublegal fish, the light blue line, they have decreased probability of survival. As I mentioned before, this is really important. They're the most released in the fishery. And survival is higher for legal-sized Chinook. So just looking at hook and gear angling treatments now, here's another Kaplan-Meier for artificials versus bait. There wasn't a huge difference here, nothing significant, which is what we expected in the troll fishery. But for hook type, we see that there is a difference here between single hooks and treble hooks. Single hooks have a higher survival probability than treble hooks. But because we use the 2 different treatments, this is a cross design, so we actually have 4 different treatments that emerge from this once you cross hook type times gear type. And what we see here is artificial gear with treble hooks they have the lowest survival, the dark blue line here. And then the dark green shows that bait with treble also has low survival. So just trebles in general are showing low survival, but it's really important when you're interpreting these results as well. Like in our fishery, fishermen don't generally fish artificial treble. They're hesitant to do so. So you need to keep that in mind when you're creating these recommendations, because the pattern here that I think is really important to focus on is just, treble hooks, decreased survival, and they're still allowed in our fishery. So we'll bring that forward. So main findings so far, the 2 simple ones, size is important. The smaller you are, the lower chance you have of survival. In addition, just survival, we noticed that the smaller fish had way more severe injuries, which fed into the survival. We're still just starting to process all this data. And then treble hooks significantly decrease the probability of survival. So going forward, I have another field season. As you notice, these results are very preliminary still, so we have a lot more advanced models and other areas to explore. And then next year, we're going to do 3 holding sessions instead of 4, so increase the densities in our tank and increase our statistical power. And then for our treatments next year, we're going to be looking at the use of flashers, flashers are heavily used in our trolling fishery, and BC. We've seen a bit of a signal for the flasher actually impacting the fish because it's kind of like, running with a kite behind you. So we're going to be testing that next year, and we're going to be using different types of landing nets because we've noticed the fins getting really frayed from certain nets as well. And these are two things that can really be promoted in best practices and also potentially in regulations. These are things that TFO or our government could use in the future. So with that, please feel free to ask me any questions. We have a lot more data than what I showed here, so if you want to know anything at all, let me know. Thank you.
All right, if I can invite all 5 speakers, Kaitlyn's already here, to come up, please, and we'll do a question-answer session now for the next 15 or 20 minutes. Anthony's going to have a microphone out in the crowd. Just while you're all sitting down, we've actually got Chinook salmon in Victoria here. We've got 2, and it's a great story, we've got 2 extinct volcanoes out, maybe 2 hours away, and our fish hatchery that's state-owned, we breed Chinook salmon and stock them in there, and it's a great fishery. So I was lucky enough when I went to the World Rec Fishing Conference in Canada, it was about 6 or 7 years ago, we went on a charter, and what a great fishery. One of the things I learnt from the charter guys, they're so careful with their fish. I don't think we're allowed to use trebles on this particular charter, and yeah, it was good. It was good. Those guys care for their fish, so I guess they're making a living out of it. So, all right, let's kick off the questions. Anyone to start off? Otherwise, I think Anthony wrote some down.
Yes, I have. I've got a few questions. All right, I'll kick it off then. Simon, I really liked your stuff about the catch and release of the sea trout. But what I took away from that is that we should ban lure fishing. Is that fair to say? As an avid fly fisherman, should I run with that one? No, I'm kidding.
Well, no, but yeah, you saw that fly fishing is a bit better, and it depends on of course, also on the fly and the hook size. So we used flies with pretty small hooks, which is common in the Danish fly fishery for sea trout, but in other countries it's different, and they use bigger hooks. So this could be different then. Yeah.
Excellent. Fly fishing is much more superior. I'll just put my hand up for that one. Miriam agrees. But I actually have a proper question, which is for Warren. Now, I saw a presentation that you did in Brazil quite a few years ago, which changed the way I look at most of my work these days, and it was around social norms. And basically the takeaway message was most people do the right thing, but if they know that it's the right thing. Did you see with your studies around the comp sector that the big selling point was that if everyone else was doing it, I would do it too? Or a big influencing factor, I should say.
The biggest thing for me was rules in that fishery. And once we switched the rules, then everyone sort of adhered to them. But having said that, everyone entered that fishery because it was the first catch and release sort of competitive fishery ever. I think the group that entered that fishery originally already had a social norm that shifted towards the idea of conservation. So I think we were clutching at low-hanging fruit, so to say, when we started an intervention with these anglers. The trick is going to be when we start intervening with other recreational groups, competitive anglers included, that don't have the same sort of social norms. So without doubt, social norms are going to influence how the anglers behave, but get your confidence up first. Get your ideas, start with the low-hanging fruit, and then as you get more confident in the way that you're doing things, try the more difficult groups. And we've started doing that in South Africa, but we're not doing as well as we did with this group. So,
excellent, thank you. Are there any other questions? Got one over here.
G'day everyone, great presentations. Matt Barwick from FRDC. Sam, a question for you. If I understand correctly, the insight was you could shape angler behaviour towards targeting desirable species that were less vulnerable but more challenging the other way. So how would you apply those insights as a manager moving forward in terms of how you go about managing fisheries of varying vulnerability?
Yeah, it's a really important one, and I mean it's a hard balance. The really beautiful thing, and I think of this project, was we're able to stick to a really positive message. Whereas as soon as we think about trying to shift that marketing message to our more vulnerable species, all of a sudden, you know, there's underlying negativity. Stop doing what you're doing, basically, which makes it a lot more challenging. So, you know, I do think that more direct messaging is needed, but maybe trying to have a mix of positive and negative ones, but linking the more negative messages to, you know, not conservation, but more around sustainability and education, and allowing people to better understand what's maybe driving the decline and why they might be vulnerable and those sorts of things. But yeah, I probably don't have a really easy, clear answer for you. Probably the only other one I'd reflect on that is if we kept doing what we were doing beyond this pilot, kept the pilot going, you could see an outcome where we've still got the same level of fishing effort on our more vulnerable species, and we're increasing fishing effort on other species. So, you know, you've got to be careful there.
Kaitlyn, you might not be aware that in Victoria here we've got some Chinook salmon as well. They're pretty cool. But the issue we've got there is they're in some deep volcanic lakes, and there's only 2 lakes where we've got them, but they're freshwater, live in deep volcanic lakes, we stock them. The issue is that they're very easy to catch when they're on the go. Even Dave Cromer can catch them, apparently. And what happens is a lot of people catch them and there's a lot of release and that sort of thing, so hooking mortality is a real issue. Because they're so deep, barotrauma is an issue. Have you looked at barotrauma on Chinooks, or is that an issue?
We have not looked at it, but they have a open swim bladder, so I think they're less susceptible than like a bottom species would be. Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in our fisheries, people catch them at like, I mean, it's funny, we're metric, but we fish in feet, 200 feet, and
that's okay.
That's pretty common. Yeah. How deep are your lakes?
What are they, 70 metres would they be, Dave? I think 70, yeah, pretty deep. Pretty deep. I'm talking.
Any other questions? Yep.
I'm not certain who answered this one, but I was in Canada about 8 years ago in Vancouver, and I went out to a hatchery, and I was told there that they, as the salmon return from the sea, they catch all the salmon and they go into the hatchery and the cannery, and all the eggs are taken out and repositioned up the river where they would originally go, and all the fish are kept for human consumption. Now, I was told that there, it's just out of, I can't remember what it is, but it was across the bridge from Vancouver, and I went for a day there. And I always wondered if that was a good idea to do or not. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, that's probably the Seymour hatchery.
It could be. My memory's not that great now. It was 8 years ago, so...
Yeah, that's a sensitive subject. Yeah, I mean, in the city like that, sometimes the hatcheries are just needed because there's so much pressure on them. I don't think it's common for people to put the eggs actually back in the river anymore. They instead like incubate them in the actual hatchery. Yeah, I mean, in those like more urban areas, I think it's sometimes needed because I think a lot of those systems are dammed as well, so they don't have their full access to what habitat they used to have. But I mean, it's system dependent, but I wouldn't recommend that for everywhere. That's for sure. Yeah.
I've got a question for Queensland. So great work. It was really good to see the big effort that's gone in there. But I was just wondering, had you thought about doing the marketing in Victoria for all the anglers that are moving up to Queensland to go fishing?
Yeah, we know the Victorians just love coming up and experiencing a world-class fishery every now and then. So it's probably not a bad idea, Jim, and, you know, maybe something we can do better next time. So, yeah, good point. While I've got the mic, could I ask Warren a question?
Go for it.
So I saw at the end of your presentation you were talking about, I guess, invest in the long term to try and develop change. Do you have any idea of how long generally it will take to really embed social norms and create that true change? Do you have any information or thoughts around that?
I think when I say you've got to be in it the long term, it's definitely context specific, and it depends on whether your anglers are invested in making a change or not. If they are, then it's quick, but behavioural change takes time, especially if you're talking about shifting social norms or that kind of thing. I mean, they're norms that have been built up over generations and generations, and to break those down or even to alter them slightly can take literally decades. So I guess the answer is start as soon as you can, but also start with what you perceive to be the easiest to get done. And once you start making headway, things become a little bit easier for both you and the anglers themselves.
Very good. Any others? All right, one over here. Yep. Oh, more Queenslanders, I think. This better not be another dig at Victoria.
No, I'm not going to have a dig at Victoria. Ian Bladen, my question's for Kaitlyn. I assume that it's difficult to equate the survivability in a sterile or non-predatory environment of a tank in comparison to actually releasing the fish in the wild. But I wonder where the 3 days seems to be a critical point. And I wonder if that had something to do with the stress of them being in a sterile environment rather than in the wild where they would normally be doing fish things, if you like, instead of just swimming round and round in circles. So I wonder whether was any work done on that?
I don't know about work done specifically on that, but it's kind of a necessary evil in this sense. Yeah, I mean, I don't think any fish is happy in a tank compared to its, natural wild environment. But I think the focus of what we do is not necessarily total survival, but the difference between the different treatments. I don't think it's necessarily something that we can say, oh, this many fish would die in the wild, because it's a completely different environment. So we're just using it to compare, is there a difference with the different treatments? Yeah, but the tagging study that I also do, more applicable, for sure.
Thank you, Kaitlyn. In relation to your presentation, you talked about the mortality rate in the smaller size fish. Is the government there looking at reducing the legal length for take, so the mortality rate is actually reduced in the wild and it's on the plate?
Like increasing the slot? Yeah, I hope so. I don't know if it's being talked about right now, but something like this should hopefully open their eyes. And we did plan this study with some members of our local government, so they're going to know about it. And we can just hope, I guess. Yeah.
Hey, thanks very much. Paul Hardy-Smith. I'm a veterinarian and I love my fishing in that. Warren, I'm probably going back to one of your comments about being in for the long term, and I'm really interested in, I suppose for me also, the ma and pop operation, the getting off the competitive people and getting the message out about what the best way is to catch and release and looking after fish. But also we have a public that are becoming far more aware of fish and what they're about and the welfare. And we heard that Travis talked about welfare. I do a lot on that side. So I think we're in a good honeymoon to get messages out now, but are we there for the long term? Because I think there's some other pressures coming on to get better at what we do quicker. Just want to hear your comment about that.
So I'm trying to make sure I'm getting this right. Sure. Can we do things quicker?
Yeah, I think as recreational anglers, we love what we do, and getting better methods in to make sure, for example, when we release fish, we're doing it in a way that gives them the best chance of being released, and we're looking after that fish and respecting it. And you were saying, well, you need to be in for the long term because it takes a long time to get this message out. I agree, but I also say there are other pressures on us from the general public about improving the game. So it's just a little bit competing it now, and I think we've had a bit of an easier run for a long time, but there is increasing pressures, as we know, about people looking after fish properly. So I think we in this area need possibly, it's good to be in the long term, but I think we also need to hurry up a bit too, particularly with some sectors. Yeah. Just a general comment. I appreciate what your experience in South Africa has been about that.
Yeah, so I agree, and I guess where we were coming from is we were actually looking at measurable change and trying to see whether we could see it. And even if you do roll out huge behavioural change intervention, over a short period of time, and you really push it in at a great level, it's not necessarily going to. It might take root, but it will take time for people's behaviour still to change. So don't think that you could push out one campaign over a single year and expect long-term change. I think you've got to invest in it and modify your campaign accordingly based on what you're seeing, and try and change and adapt all the time to try and look for the behaviours that you are wanting to see. There's no way that well, I'd be very surprised if you had a single campaign that could just change things immediately. So I think regardless of the way that you look at it, and we had a fairly easy example of behavioural change because we had anglers that were invested already. If you look at the general angling public, I think there's going to be a lot of people that you're going to have to do quite a lot of convincing to get them to change the way that they have been for the last 5 decades or 4 decades, whatever the case is. So, but that's my opinion from.
This question's for Katie. Thanks for an awesome presentation, Katie. And I think as a fellow Canadian, we can say with confidence that Chinook are likely the best game fish in the world. But further to the question asked earlier about barotrauma, we don't really see any evidence of barotrauma when we're catching Chinook, but one of the other things that happens with them, particularly say you're down 70 meters, 200 feet, that kind of stuff, is as they come up through the water column to the boat, they will experience a change in pressure, but often they'll experience changes in water temperature, particularly as they get closer to the surface. So what's your experience or knowledge associated with the water temperature effects on Chinook, which probably is quite relevant to these lake fisheries that the folks have here?
Yeah, my tagging research, I attach temperature loggers onto my fish and then track them from the ocean through their spawning migrations. I'll talk about that in my talk this afternoon. Yeah, Chinook salmon don't do well, different thresholds, but over 18 degrees. And I found in my tagging work that they often experience temperatures up to 21 degrees throughout much of their river migration. And yeah, we're still trying to pick this apart, but that's in the freshwater side. But we're also seeing impacts of exposure in surface water as well that could stress them out further. It's those cumulative stressors, so they're stressed from being caught. They're in a temperature that stresses them out, and then there's also the interactions with infectious agents and pathogens that can do better in these warm temperatures as well. So yeah, we're still looking at these questions, but a huge part of my research is these cumulative effects and, how do we move forward with warming water as we keep, stressing these fish out. So yeah, looking into that more and more, but more this afternoon.
Probably last question, I reckon.
Thank you very much for presentations, and this is a question about the marketing, and specifically the campaigns to change angler behavior. And the gist of the question is, What do a lot of you think about the long-term implications of our science-based organizations purposely trying to alter social norms? And the reason I ask this is because, at least in some countries of the world, I think we've seen a shift in how the public trusts different institutes that give out information, whether that's media, whether that's courts, whether that's elected officials. And science has always sat sort of at this intersection of advocacy and just saying what is as opposed to what should be. So I'm curious if you have some thoughts about what we may be getting ourselves into as we increasingly engage in trying to actively shape what people do, and whether there may be some unintended consequences down the road of that.
Yeah, so I've got probably a couple of key takeaways from the one I was involved in. Firstly, this wasn't a government-led program. I highlighted at the start it was actually Curry Consulting, Griffith Social Marketing. These guys drove the program and were able to engage in a way that we weren't as a government agency. And I think that was extremely important. I think it would have taken us as government a lot longer time to build the rapport with fishers to get them on board. Probably the second one is that the people that are experts and work in the behaviour change space, like I'm a biologist by trade, they think completely differently to what I do. And I have a whole new appreciation, and I think if we're looking to, work further in this space, getting people on who, understand what behaviour change means, that they're invested in that as their field is also a really important first step, and continuing to consider that social element, not just thinking, we know best, as people engage with fishers that, this will be the most effective way. So that'd be two takeaways from me.
Working in Sweden, I mean, a lot of the people in the angling community are asking for this information, wanting to do things better as well, and coming to us as scientists wanting, what can they do? And so we're being asked to step in and have a moral obligation to communicate the best information that we can. And so at least there is like some direct demand. It's not just us coming in and pushing our message, although there are cases, particularly where you've got threatened species and things where it is time sensitive. If we just put the information out there but don't actively promote it, we're going to be missing the boat to actually make a difference and save species or save ecosystems, keep things where people can continue fishing for these fish, and have a more gradual change in behavior rather than all of a sudden this fishery has to be completely closed because that's the only step that we can take to keep any of those fish in the water. So there are a few different things to look at from that side as well.
All right, well, that's the end of the questions. Have a big round of applause for Warren, Simon, both Sams and Kaitlyn. It's just after midday, so lunch is, I think, out in the foyer here. And we've got an hour, so back into the next sessions at 1 p.m. Thank you.